thing that might be worth considering is the relative decline in taxonomic knowledge. For a lot of these insect groups, the experts are literally dying off. So in some ways, taxonomy does seem to be sort of a dying field. And so having these more accessible keys kind of helps alleviate that in some ways.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
There are over 1,000 species of bees in the Pacific Northwest, making this a real hub of bee biodiversity in North America. Now, maybe you know, there's an explosion of interest in exploring this fauna through the Atlas initiatives in British Columbia, Washington, Idaho, and here in Oregon. But the resources that are available for somebody to tell the bees apart are lacking for this region. Today, we're going to hear from a team that has made a gargantuan leap forward through the publication of 4 new taxonomic keys to the bees of the Pacific Northwest region. The team includes, from Oregon State University, Lincoln Best, who's the taxonomist with the Oregon Bee Atlas, who we've had on previous episodes, as well as August Jackson, who is the Refuge Program Coordinator and Taxonomist, also on a previous episode, and Dr. Jim Rivers, who's an Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology in the College of Forestry, also a previous guest. From the Oregon Department of Agriculture, we have Joshua Dunlap, who's an entomologist and digital imaging specialist who made a lot of the images in these new resources, these new keys. We're also joined by retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist Joe Engler. And finally, our host today is someone who has a lot of experience using these keys, Carol Yamada. Carol is a journey-level master melittologist. Now, the journey level is exceptionally hard to get through. It involves this grueling taxonomy test where you have to identify bees in a little unit tray and you've got a timer going. This means it translates into, being able to do this. You have superb competency at using these keys, and Carol is really good at using the keys. So without further ado, let me hand things over to Carol as we go down the bee taxonomy rabbit hole this week on PolliNation.
Hi, I'm Carol Yamada. Welcome to PolliNation. This week's going to be an exciting news about taxonomic keys. But we have a lot of people that worked on these keys, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. So, Joe, could you go first?
Yeah, I'm Joe Engler. I work for the Atlas. I'm primarily in the taxonomy and as an instructor for the microscope sessions as well as field instruction.
Josh?
I'm Joshua Dunlap. I work at the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and I contributed many of the technical photographs for the bee keys.
Cool. Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim Rivers. I'm a professor in the College of Forestry at OSU and do research on birds and on bees.
And August?
Yeah, I'm August Jackson. I work in the Pollinator Health Lab, and I am coordinating a program for the inventory and monitoring of native bees on Pacific Region 1 National Wildlife Refuges. So that's in Oregon, Washington, Idaho.
And Link.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lincoln Best. I'm the taxonomist for the Oregon Bee Atlas.
Great. Okay, well, we're going to start off explaining for people who are not familiar with a taxonomic key what they are and why they're useful. Josh, could you explain that?
Sure. Well, at their most basic, taxonomic key is a key to establishing identity. It's an identification key. And for the Bee Project course, we had 3 separate keys. One specific to males of the bombus, the bumblebees, one specific to female bombus, and one that was to bee genera more generally. Now, traditionally, keys have been dichotomous keys, text-based keys, and I actually went out to find a pretty good and stereotypical example of that because they tend to be very technical, very jargon-heavy. So one example I found that I think really helps illustrate that is this one for a key to Staphylinus, a type of beetle. And the couplet goes, Last segment of labial palpus narrower than penultimate. Cylindrical. Temporal longer than eyes. Subparallel. Pronotum elongate. If you're not a trained entomologist, that's a lot of blah, blah, and blah. So these kind of keys require a lot of technical skill, a lot of technical experience to actually be able to use. And so more recently, there have been a shift towards more photo-based keys for establishing identification because those are so much more accessible. But at their core, these keys are for identification. And that's certainly what the Bee project was focusing on. Did someone else want to add something to that?
Yeah, I can. So in the last year, we published 4 keys, 3 supported through the College of Forestry with Jim, and a 4th key that was produced by Joe Engler, Mark Gorman, David Kappert, Merrick Stanton, and others. And all of the keys, the general goal was to make the identification process for these groups approachable for someone with a much more introductory level of skills. And that's why we use these resources now in our intermediate or beginner bee course.
So before there were these keys, what did people use? Link?
That's a great question. So specifically, our replacement for these several years ago was for the bumblebees, we would use Robin Thorpe's Key to the Bumblebees of California from, I think, the late 60s. And then we were fortunate to have Paul Williams and others publish their Field Guide to the Bumblebees of North America, which has a few different strategies for identifying bumblebees in it, including dichotomous keys. However, those keys the images are very small. They're kind of postage stamp sized, and the reproduction is very, very dark with high contrast, so very either black or very white. And the parts of the insects that were shown were very shiny, and it was difficult to interpret some of those. And for bee genera, again, we were using just a combination of whatever resources were available. And for our region, that was Key to the Bee genera of Canada, which isn't necessarily an equivalent region to the Pacific Northwest or Western North America. And so we would also use the bee genera of North and Central America, a publication by Michener, McGinley, and Danforth from about 1994, 1996. But that key has about 275 couplets. It keys out many, many more genera than are in our region. And so something simplified and more specific was really needed. Jim, what were you using?
Yeah, so I guess I can talk about the kind of the motivation for these keys because, as I mentioned earlier, I am a researcher, and for most of my career, I've worked with birds. And birds are the type of organism that you can get a field guide and you can learn all about how to identify them and their life history traits and things like that. But about a decade ago or so, I started getting interested in bees and very naively thought, well, there must be a field guide to the bees that I could use and learn them in the same way. And I figured out quickly that was not the case, that dichotomous keys really needed to be used. And it was in 2018, I was fortunate enough to be part of the Oregon Bee School that Link was leading, and Joe and August were involved with as well. And I remember very distinctly the first morning we were going around the room giving introductions, talking about our interests related to bees. And then we started working on the key that we had that Link passed out. And it was noteworthy to me because it was a photo-based key, as Joshua said earlier. So that caught my eye. But what really surprised me was as we went through, Link said, there's some genera that we're going to cross out here. And I'd never seen a key be modified like that before. And I wondered, well, geez, that's interesting. I wonder why we're doing this. So when the class was over, I went up to Link and said, hey, tell me more about this key. And he said, well, this is the best that we have right now for the Pacific Northwest. And we have this older key that's, nearly 50 years old, but it has a lot of the same challenges that Joshua described in terms of having very jargony language that's hard for intermediate and entry-level bee students to learn about, and no photos, no color or anything like that. So what you're looking at for the image is often an idealized drawing that doesn't really match what you look at under the scope and see. So I said, Linker, would you be interested if we could find support for funding for a new key to really, make it our own. Would you be interested? And he said, heck yeah, I'm interested. And so at that point I said, well, we have some funding in the College of Forestry and the Fish and Wildlife Habitat and Managed Forest Research Program, and they might be interested in funding some of the work on this key. And so we started looking into that option. We started talking with Joshua and others at Oregon Department of Agriculture and found that there's a lot of support across the board for it. And lo and behold, a few months later, we had a grant in hand, and the rest is history.
So you've been working on this project then since 2018?
2019 is when the funding came in, and then, as you all know, the COVID came in shortly thereafter, and so that really inhibited our progress on it. So fortunately, we were able to get an extension on the grant and be able to complete it as we had hoped to. It just took a little bit longer than expected.
I would chime in that, the motivation a little bit for the Lazoglossum key was the fact that there were no real keys for the Western United States. We had 5 subgenera. Sensu stricto does have a key from 1986, I believe. And there was a little bit on a couple of Sphacotogastra. And Dialictus, we were having to use Dialictus of Canada, which included quite a few of our species, but certainly not all of them we're finding out. So I think really the motivation for Lazoglossum was to get something that was useful. In the previous project I worked on for 7 years with Fish and Wildlife Service, we amassed thousands of Lazoglossums and nobody could identify them. And I kind of found that a little bit disconcerting over the decades that, these things were just sitting there and we couldn't do anything with them. So again, that was sort of a personal motivation on my point to try to get through some of these things and figure them out. So that's kind of where I think I came from in terms of the Lazoglossum and focusing on those 3 subgenera at this point, which we had no information really whatsoever.
So all of these keys are like first time for the Pacific Northwest. They really fill a gap in. For people who don't know, what is a dichotomous key? August? How does it work?
Well, a dichotomous key is one that basically you're just presented with 2 options, right? So it's kind of a choose your own adventure format. And that's the classic form of a key, and they tend to work really well. More recently, people are incorporating sort of matrix-based keys a little bit more frequently, which allows a user to sort of say yes or no to a suite of characters so that they don't necessarily get bogged down in one specific step in the key. And that's one of the real challenges of a dichotomous key is if you get stuck at a point in a couplet and you're not really sure where to go, that can really hinder your progress. And so, each key has its merits, and dichotomous keys are certainly easier to produce in a print format, which was helpful in our case this time.
One thing with dichotomous keys I'd like to add there is that when they're good, but when they're bad, they're absolutely useless. Something I was told by Paul Skelly, who's an aphodiine expert, a group of dung beetles, is that keys are often created by people who don't need them for people who aren't going to be able to use them. And so that really is, like August was saying, with having the images and being able to create matrix keys also, which are a totally different type of key. They're useful for a much, much larger audience. Who makes a key also matters a great deal because depending on what characters you're using, they can be so dense that they're not practical. Something that I think we definitely avoided with the bee keys.
And Carol, this is Jim. I'll just speak to the point of, I don't think we've talked about this necessarily, but we all have a lot of concerns about pollinators and their declines. And so understanding which species we have where. I'm in the College of Forestry, so I do a lot of work within managed forest, looking at natural disturbances and anthropogenic disturbances like timber harvest. In forests, we don't have a great understanding of what species are there. We're certainly, it's improved a lot over the last decade or so. But my motivation coming in on this was really to be able to use these keys in a research context to ask questions, hypothesis-driven questions about when we do something to our forests, what does that do to the bee community? And without having these sorts of resources available, we can't answer those questions. That turned out to be really critical for conservation and management. So I think that's another important motivation behind the keys.
Yeah, and this is Joe. And one of the things I'll just chime in is, part of what I see the usefulness for the keys we're doing is they're pretty much tailored to the Pacific Northwest. So depending on the keys you look at, I think I was looking at even the Dialectus of Canada, we probably, have half of the species in that key maybe. So it's useful to a point. The eastern key for the other three subgenera of Laezoglossom, there were only 5 potential species in the west that were taken up in that eastern key. So kind of in tailoring these to Pacific Northwest, it gets rid of a lot of species potentially that aren't found here. And that helps a lot, particularly for beginners and amateurs, to get through these keys a lot easier. When you can carve things down, it makes a big difference in terms of your own motivation to keep trying to plug through these keys. And, when you get to a dead end, you want to give up, or do you turn around? Do you have to go back 100 couplets to start over again, or can it just be 5? So one of the things we're looking at right now is streamlining the key for Laezoglossom sensu stricto. And I just looking at some numbers. McGinley did the key originally way back in 86. He talks about 51 species in that publication, 30 of those north of Mexico, but we only have 14 in the Pacific Northwest. So what we're doing is trying to pare that down to what we can use more efficiently here, instead of having people get frustrated going through keys and couplets that really have no bearing on what they're looking at potentially. So it kind of, to me, helps eliminate some of the frustration and helps in the efficiency of getting these things identified. So.
Yeah, I started the Master Melitologist program in 2020 and went to B school in 21 and 22. So I used the old keys, and there were some really arcane things in there. And so I think that the new keys are so much better. I'm a fangirl. I love them. And I'd like you to talk a little bit, maybe Link, you could start, or August, about how you designed these with the new novice bee identifiers in mind. There's a lot of little tricks you put in there to make it easier for us.
Absolutely. I'll talk about the architecture a little bit, and then I'll have August talk about the design, which he was responsible for. So we started, or I should say I started initially by just gathering up all the old keys that were available for the bumblebees and for the bee genera. And that's because most of the key characters for these groups have already been worked out. And so one of the key things we were missing really was having a simplified format, like Joe mentioned, where we don't have maybe dozens or more species or genera that aren't relevant to our region. So by removing those, and then by focusing in on the most difficult parts of our fauna, whether it's bumblebee species, especially the males, which are quite a bit more variable in their color forms, or those more difficult genera, mostly the panergines and the osmiines, both of which have many kind of little black individuals or genera. We're able to utilize some of the old key architectures that separate these basic characters and then add some new ones. The other thing we tried to limit as much as possible are conditional statements. So a lot of keys will rely on sometimes multiple conditional statements, and it just really wears you out, and they're difficult to interpret. Good example of those are if, and, or, then statements, where if this character and that character or this character, then this potential outcome or that potential outcome or these potential outcomes. And then sometimes even more conditional statements. And it's like, well, it's almost impossible to work your way through those. We still rely on lots of keys that have those. Shout out to LaBerge and others. So we tried to limit that as much as possible, just to keep it simple. I've taught these bee courses many, many times, and so I know where everyone gets hung up in all the different resources. And so we focused on a lot of those kind of pinch points in people's progress, improve their outcome. One thing we found now over the last couple of years, or I should say the last 2 years, having these new keys, either in draft form or in finish form, is that our intermediate bee school course, which really the curriculum parallels our keys. So that course is all about bumblebees to species identifications, and the remaining bees ID to bee genera. What we found is that people are far more productive now in those courses, so they move through the resources more effectively, and that has an additional benefit, which is people don't get as fatigued as quickly. So if you have to grind through a bunch of these conditional statements, people get just cognitively fatigued very quickly, myself included. And so the keys have had the benefit of increasing efficiency and accuracy, and also just reducing the fatigue for people using those resources. August?
Yeah, so I think Lynn covered a lot of it pretty well, but we spent a good amount of time figuring out where we could simplify some of these really challenging characters. And, pouring through older keys, we found that a lot of authors had figured out, at least for a section of the fauna, shortcuts, sort of, to get around some of these stumbling blocks. Like for a lot of beginners, one of the real challenges is with certain genera in the Endrinidae, right? You're looking for 2 subantennal sutures, and that's kind of your only way to pull that grouping out in a lot of the keys that we've been using. But we found ways to circumvent that in a lot of cases, which just removes a stumbling block. There's still plenty of challenging characters in there, particularly for anyone who's kind of a beginner, because this stuff is it's innately challenging. But we were able to remove a lot of these big stumbling blocks by just kind of carefully examining things, looking specifically at our fauna, checking specimens, things like that. And then we decided that it would be really important for the design and layout to have it so that there's one couplet per page, so that we could really focus on providing very large and fantastic images that Joshua took primarily. And so we really wanted it to be a highly visual key that was extremely user-friendly, and also provided people with sort of reassurances along the way. So, at the bottom of each page, we have genera that are remaining in the key, or the bumblebee species that are remaining in the key. So if you, kind of have a little bit of background and feel like you might know what species it is, and realize that you've already passed that might be a clue that you go back and double check. So those were the sorts of things that we took into account to really try to make this as accessible as possible. And I think we got pretty close.
Yeah, that part at the bottom of the page is really helpful, because if you don't really know what you're doing, there's a lot of guesswork going on. And if you go, well, I know it's not these species, then I'll just go back and start over again. So that was very helpful. Josh, you want to talk about the photography? There's a lot of amazing images in these keys.
Yeah, so we did do a lot of the photography here at the Oregon Department for Agriculture. We used our photo stacking system, which is a digital visionary. And so we used the stacking system to create these images, usually under high magnification, with microscope objectives as needed. For creating the pictures, for some of the images, they're really quite straightforward. Things that are very two-dimensional, like the wings, where you're looking at wing venation, that's very easy. It's almost like photographing a leaf in some ways. On the other hand, small, shiny, hairy, those are very challenging, particularly if you have all 3 at once. To stack the images, we use a program called Zareen. There's also USDA, when I worked for them, used Helicon. But we use Zareen here, and it definitely has a lot of trouble with small, hairy, and shiny. And when you get all 3 together, sometimes the algorithm will put together an image that looks like melted Barbie hair at the end, which is definitely an artifact of the said algorithm. But really, I think having those pictures just makes the keys so much useful, which is, of course, why we included them. When you, like we were saying earlier, when you have those images to compare against, when you have the actual specimen and you can see the picture, oh, it does look like that, or no, it doesn't look like that. It just makes the keys so much more functional. And so we do a lot of that here at the ODA. Currently, we're working on a identification tool for Agrilus, another economically important group of insects, including the emerald ash borer, which is now in the state. So creating the images, taking them isn't usually too challenging, except for you got to make sure the lighting is correct. That's a very important factor there. But the average image, the average photograph we took probably had 100 or a couple hundred individual images, which are then combined to be stacked into the single high high quality image. So it was somewhat time consuming, but I think when you see the results you get from that and how useful they are, it really is worthwhile.
Wow, a couple hundred images.
Yeah, the stacks were some of the photographs, particularly when there's a lot of depth to them. This can be very large stacks. Though there is a point where you reach diminishing returns, and your image gets worse for having more images or more individual stacks than better.
Joe, with your key, you didn't have the same kind of resources that Link has for this key.
No, to say the least. Mark and I and David, we kind of did this key on a shoestring budget, if any budget whatsoever. Pretty much all volunteer to get in there and put this thing together. Mark and David did all the photography. Mark Gorman basically learned quite a bit from David Capert on that in terms of the stacking and how to do a lot of the photography. I was pretty much useless in any of that. And I think one of the things that I think came out of that to a point is because they were instilling the photography and the figures into the key itself, they could give me feedback as to what was even useful or not. Because I can go in there and say, well, I think we need this, this, and this. But to me, I can't think of how it's helping the beginner very well. But they were very good at pointing out some things that were useful, some things that weren't. So then we can kind of switch directions, put in a better photograph or put in a couple photographs or do something a little bit different. So yeah, so as of this point, yeah, it's pretty much has been really driving the photography of everything we've been working on. So.
Jim, have you been using the keys in your work, in your field work?
So this is Jim. I have not, because I now have a whole bunch of graduate students who are doing that sort of work, and I actually don't get into the lab very often to use the keys. But everything I've heard from them, they really enjoy them and they really appreciate them.
Has anybody else heard any feedback from either students or your professional equals?
This is Lincoln. We've gotten lots of feedback. So during the process of designing these keys, we were giving them to our Oregon Bee School participants to work through and provide criticism. And so we were fortunate that probably 50 to 100 people were able to provide us feedback and commentary on the keys throughout their design. And that was incredibly valuable. So much in the way that Joe, working with Mark Gorman and David Capert, was able to design some of the couplets in a bit of an iterative method, getting feedback and then redesigning some things. We were able to do the same thing using people that attended our Oregon Bee School sessions. Most of those were people enrolled in our Master Melitologist program and volunteering for the Oregon Bee Atlas. So, and they're among, this big suite of potential users. Once the keys were published, we've continued to use them in our courses, as well as they're being used more broadly. And so we've continued to get feedback from people about, these are extremely, even though we've tried to simplify them as much as possible, they're still extremely technical and full of millions of little details. And so we have gotten continuous feedback, and I think we published a second version of the initial 3 keys, the 2 bumblebee keys and the generic key, and we have still additional revisions. Our fauna is not final by any means. These species move around, including this past summer in Oregon. The Fish and Wildlife Service found a new bumblebee for Oregon. So although we had kind of expected it to show up here eventually, it wasn't in the key. And so we're adding, of course, an additional couplet to cover that new species detection. So they're living documents, and it's nice that we're able to manage all of these images, this huge reservoir of images, as well as the documents themselves, to continuously improve them and also make additions where necessary. One of the other challenges is that taxonomy itself is not really finalized, and so the names and some of the phylogenetic relationships of these things are still changing here and there, especially as as the systematists conduct more kind of larger scale molecular analyses of how different genera are related to one another and where we might be able to split some of these bumblebee species. So we're able to adapt our keys as things change or new discoveries are made.
Who would like to talk about the bumblebee keys and why we have male and female bumblebee keys separate? Anybody? August?
Sure. I'll jump in and do that. So it's really useful to separate the males and females in our bumblebee keys because they look so different. So our females are largely identifiable based on external morphology and particularly the hair color, right? If you look through our keys, you'll notice that there are things other than hair color, such as cheek length, where the ocelli are located, things like that are a little more technical. But once you get through that, you're really looking a lot at just the hair color. And the hair color is a lot less meaningful for male bumblebees. We have a lot of male bumblebees that are just kind of yellow. And so that is a real impediment to identification. And so we rely a lot on internal morphology, and that's the male genital capsule. And so we separate the two sexes to be able to really focus on what's most useful for identification in each instance. And with males, a lot of it is reliant on the genital capsule, and color is important too. We definitely have a lot of the color forms in the male key, but it's de-emphasized a little bit.
So probably our listeners are wondering how they can get their hands on these keys. How do you get them? Are they online? Do you have to order them from a bookstore? Who knows that?
So we published the keys through the Oregon State University Library in the Scholars Archive. So these keys are freely available as PDF documents, and we update that archive with the new versions as we release them. The OSU library has been super easy to work with and very helpful in accomplishing that. So these are archived, they have a DOI and everything. You can order hard copies by going to the Oregon Bee Atlas website, and you will find a link and a way to pay to obtain hard copies of these documents. They're published on nice heavy cardstock in full color, and they range from kind of $15 to $25 each. So it just mostly covers printing cost, there you go, and the shipping. We've sent out hundreds of these in the past year, so they've been well received. And we hope to continue to produce keys as we're able. And fortunately, Joe and Mark and others are hard at work on some new Lasioglossum and Sphecodes resources.
Are there any other keys in the works for you guys?
That's a good question. So in a way, I support some of that work because we're doing a lot of DNA barcoding, which is really instrumental in differentiating a lot of these poorly known genera. So we use genetic data to help us separate poorly known species of Lasioglossum or of Sphecodes, which are cuckoos of other sweat bees. Both of these groups are generally very poorly known. And so using the genetic barcoding, we can kind of aggregate individuals with similar genetics with one another, and then find morphological characters to differentiate those genetic groups from other groups. So this is a process that we've been working on with Joe. Joe's been working on this tirelessly. And so once we're able to, craft a species concept for these things, and Joe digs through the literature to find out if this potential species concept already has a name, then he or we are slowly able to then put together some couplets to help sort these things out. And so where are you, Joe, with the sensu stricto and the Sphecodes subgenera?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is Joe. Yeah, for the Lasioglossum sensu stricto, as I mentioned, we are taking much of what McGinley put together. We are paring it down to just those species within the Pacific Northwest. And we have captured, I think, or collected all but two of those through the Atlas already, through the Master Melitologist program. I know of couple more that are up in Idaho and Washington that we have yet to find. But anyway, will be included in the key. We have both male and females. Mark's doing the final photography right now. In fact, he may be done, and he's probably just waiting for me to put some finishing touches on it. And then we will send it to the production manager, August, and let him start making it nice and pretty for us. So that one's pretty close. Hopefully, late winter, early spring, we'll have something more available. The other one I'm just starting to look at is on Sphecodes. As Link was mentioning, we got a lot of barcodes back on Sphecodes. If you thought Lasoglossum was a mess, Sphecodes is worse. But anyway, we've got a few things on some of the half a dozen or so larger specimens or larger species. I think I've got those figured out. When it comes to the very small Sphecodes, if you look at the barcoding and you take the standard of a 3% difference to recognize a species, we have one species of small one. But if you look at the morphological differences and some of the other things at a less than 2% difference in DNA, we probably have 10 to 15. So, and of course, there's basically no names for those. So that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. But again, we'll have, hopefully, I'm just really started that a couple of weeks ago. So we have something for the medium and large Sphecodes. I'm not sure when I'll get to the small ones. But that's, again, in the works, and they'll be male and female. And I guess those are the things we have going right now. If possible, at some point in there, we'll try to do our Lasoglossum key for the 3 subgenre was females only. I'm hoping to do at least a male key for Sphecodogastra and Evolaeus. Hemihalictus has since now been done out of the University of Manitoba, so I don't necessarily have a strong feeling for doing that. Plus, we don't have all the male specimens we need as it is, so it would be incomplete. So anyway, maybe male Sphecodogastra as well as Evolaeus in the future. Which one gets done first, I don't know, but that's kind of what's on my radar.
Well, there's a lot to look forward to. The keys are going to keep coming out. Jim, you kind of spearheaded this with your suggestion a long time ago. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
This is Jim. I think it's really cool to see these keys coming into being. And, as I think early on when Joshua was describing some of the challenges of working with keys and the description that he gave, I'm one of those end users who's not an entomologist by training. And so these terms are challenging for me to keep track of. And I know I'm not alone in that. There's a lot of folks who are in my lab or who I work with who really benefit by having something that's user friendly. We keep using that term, but it's a really important one, and making this accessible. And I think now more than ever, with the concerns that we have about bee declines and pollinator population declines, it's having keys available is allowing us not just to understand what's there, but how these species are being impacted by a myriad of threats that they're undergoing. So I see the keys as being integral for doing research and making sure that we're understanding these groups and their value and how they are a big part of different parts of our state, for example. And again, I'll go back to forests where we don't know that much relative to some other settings. These keys are really helping us to advance our research, and for that reason, they're incredibly important.
One thing I'd like to add, if I could, Jim was mentioning declining factors. Another thing that might be worth considering is the relative decline in taxonomic knowledge, too. For a lot of these insect groups, the experts are literally dying off. So in some ways, taxonomy does seem to be sort of a dying field. And so having these more accessible keys kind of helps alleviate that in some ways.
Ashmediella are really hard for me to ID, so if you have any suggestions for that, I'm excited. And then, Link, what's the new bumblebee in our state?
Yeah, so at this past summer's Franklin's Bumblebee survey event on Mount Ashland, hosted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Jeff Everett and others, Trinity Harvey, who I believe is Fish and Wildlife Service out of Roseburg, found a Bombus crotchii at Grouse Gap. And so this is a bumblebee whose center of abundance is probably the Central Valley of California. There are some historical records extending kind of into Northern California. And so we've been anticipating finding them somewhere along, somewhere between Lake County and Curry County along that stretch bordering Northern California. And, especially given the intensity of our survey effort in those areas, either with traps or just, feet on the ground through the Atlas Initiative. And so that's really exciting. Bombus crotchii. It's a new bumblebee for Oregon, and it's only known in the state from one specimen. And it's this one specifically. There you go. It's this one. Bombus crotchii are cool. They have very, very short hair. They have yellow and orange, and they're striped like many bumblebees. And so they look very velvety. And the queens, this one's a worker, but the queens are, among those bumblebees that have the giant queens. And so you can't miss it. I think the most recent additional record for that species was found in one of Enkazi's, one of their survey sites, maybe even in the Dixie Fire in Northern California. And I wanted to make sure that I took the opportunity to acknowledge as many of the contributors to these initiatives as possible, because this really is, or has relied upon many, many people. So let's see here. We would like to thank everyone who's donated to the Jerry Paul and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Fund. So that has supported a lot of our molecular work. It supported my salary specifically, enabling us to work on these type of things. We've had some individuals donate specifically for DNA barcoding of Lasioglossum. So Jean, thank you, and Pam, thank you. Thank you also to our admin and our faithful leader, Adoni Milthopoulos and Jen Larson. Thank you also to the folks at Enkazi who've been great collaborators, and others, the Department of Agriculture. Also, thank you to Chris Marshall, the curator of the Oregon State Arthropod Collection, who's been an important collaborator for us. One thing we kind of skipped over when we were talking about those bumblebee keys is that we had one really important collaborator, and that was Paul Williams from the Natural History Museum in London in the UK. And I think Paul is probably the world's bumblebee expert in general. He's a lead author for the North American Field Guide, and also has produced several hundred of these color templates to represent the bumblebees that you see in the Field Guide. And we're fortunate to collaborate with Paul on these bumblebee keys and use those really perfect color templates in our key to just make it as simple as possible. And also, this way, our key can be used kind of in parallel with the Field Guide as well. So you're not, I try to avoid reinventing the wheel, and square wheels in particular. So we want to use the best resources that are available. Those were the best ones, and so we're fortunate to be able to incorporate that into our work.
I'll just jump in here, and while we're thanking folks for the three keys that I was involved with, the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Managed Forest Research Program in the College of Forestry was a group that we went to with this idea, and they typically don't fund these sorts of things, at least in my experience. But when Link gave the final presentation and kind of showed what we were able to do with the funding, there was nothing but accolades from that group. So we're really happy with that collaboration that we had with them, and that they were able to fund this, because without their support, without support from other groups, I don't think this would have come together.
Well, thank you everyone for telling us about the keys and being on the episode today. And thanks to everyone who tunes into PolliNation.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.